Welcome to this guide to AQA Paper 2, Question 4, Comparison of Writers' Views and Perspectives. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you will have a much better idea of how to do well in this really important 16-mark answer on the English language paper. As the title of the presentation suggests, the focus for this particular question are the writers, what they think, which is what's suggested by the word viewpoints, and their perspectives, which is the various factors that influence their opinions. I think this image really illustrates very well what we're looking at. It's quite a famous image. It's called The Blind Men and the Elephant, and the whole point of the image, as you can see, each blind person is at a different point of the elephant, and their perspective dictates what they think the elephant is, and for each of them it's a different thing. And this is what we mean by perspective. When a writer writes a text, there are all kinds of influences that dictate how they write that text and what their opinions are, and those influences can be to do with gender. It can be to do with religion, the country that they're brought up in, or the cultural influences. It can also be to do with time. So if you think about it, this paper, you have to look at two texts. One is written in the 19th century, and one is a much more modern text, either a 20th century or a 21st century text. They will have the same topic in order for you to do a comparison, but those perspectives are going to be completely different. So for example, if you have a woman writing in the 21st century about a particular topic, her perspective is going to be completely different than a man writing about it in the 19th century, for lots of different reasons, not least because the position of women in the 21st century is so much different than the position of women in the 19th century. So that's what we're talking about when we look at viewpoints and perspectives. So to do well in this particular answer, you need to be able to really focus in on who the writers are and what that might suggest about their opinions and how it might influence their opinions. So the focus is very much on the writers, what their viewpoints are and their perspectives. In other words, the various factors that influence what they might think about a topic. Here we have the question for success criteria. Basically, that means you need to do these things to get the marks, and if you miss any of them out, it's going to impact on the final mark that you get. So the first bullet point there is to look at the first text, so source A, and to make points, big points about the writer's viewpoint on the particular topic that the source might be about. And obviously, if you make very simple points, that will impact on what your grade is likely to be. So you need to really home in on what you think the key points are and formulate some strong ideas to get the best marks possible for the kinds of things you are saying. To support that, you obviously have to provide evidence. If you don't quote or even point to some details from the text, it does undermine the points that you've made. It also doesn't allow you to identify the methods and the devices that the writer is using, and that's another one of the success criteria. So you can't simply say what you think the writer's viewpoint is without those other steps to give it much more emphasis and to demonstrate your real understanding. Then you have to talk about what those various things show about the writer's views and intentions. If that wasn't enough, there's then a requirement to compare it with another source. So the second source will have another writer's point of view about a very similar subject. So you need to be able to make those comparisons, and they need to be direct comparisons, not simply writing about source A and writing about source B separately. You really need to draw the comparisons yourself. Just so you are aware of what a question looks like, it will be pretty much like this. So this is from a past exam paper. It's 16 marks. It's the question on section A of paper 2 that gives you the most number of marks. It's made pretty clear at the start you need to refer to the whole of source A and the whole of source B. So you need to get a range of points from across both texts. Because there are a lot of marks available, you would expect to have a number of points in both texts, a number of points of comparison. As I said already, you're comparing how they convey, that means how they show their different ideas and perspectives. So contained within that is the idea of comparing language techniques. Okay, and then we have the bullet points at the end, just summarizing the things we've already said. Different ideas and perspectives, methods, and supporting your response with references to both texts. Here we've got the top tips. Try to include more than one quotation to support your point. So if you make a point, you have to have at least one quotation, but it might be better if you've got more than one piece of evidence to support a point. Certainly within each text, I would expect to see a number of different quotations to support a range of points. You certainly can't get away with just making one point and expect to get a mark that gives you one of the top grades. It says explain all quotations, but really it's a bit more than explain. You're showing analysis skills. You have to go beyond what you think it means. So to do that, you have to zoom in on key words. You have to use subject terminology, and then you need to make the comparison with the other text. So when it talks about comparatives and connectives, that's what that is about, and it is a comparison question. So that is a really important part of what you have to do. So we're just going to have a look at one example of two texts of a similar topic. Both the texts I've chosen are to do with disease and people's experiences of disease. It's really important that you look at the information, the blurb if you like, at the beginning of the source before you actually start reading the source, because it will give you a huge amount of possibly useful information about the perspective of the writer. So this source, is the cholera near Golden Square, is written by someone in 1854. So that's important because perspectives on illness then are different than they are now. The other thing about this particular example is that it is a doctor, and we find out from the blurb also that he is the doctor who believes he knows what the source of the cholera is. So it's obviously a really important document, this. So what I would like you to do now is to pause the video for a few moments, read the text, and identify the language features that you would use for this particular example. So how can you show that you understand what the writer's perspective is? What techniques does he use? What is the tone of the text? Are there any keywords that jump out at you that suggest certain things about this writer's point of view? So I'm just going to allow you a moment there to pause the video, get your pad out and make some notes, and see in a moment if you picked up on any of the points that I make. Okay, so these are the different language examples that I identified. I'm just going to run through a few of them. I think one of the things that struck me about this text is it is a doctor, and you can tell that his reason for writing it is a professional. So if you look at the use of language, I've identified 3 different types of language feature that I would respond to in the exam. So for the first one in the turquoise is the description of death. So we've got lots of phrases that talk about death. We've got an outbreak of cholera, which obviously is a reference to the disease. We've got the phrase mortality in this limited area. Mortality is another word for death. Mortality is mentioned again slightly lower down as well. We've got a reference to the death of the proprietors. And we've got use of 2 words, afflicted and malady. So all those words to do with death. However, they're presented in quite a formal way. There's very little personal comment about the impact of those deaths. It's presented as evidence, and I think one of the things about the tone of this writing is that it's very much written from the point of view of somebody who's a professional who is putting forward evidence. There are a couple of uses of language that you could home in on that you might say were emotive, but I'm not even sure they are really. So that, you know, the opening line, the most terrible outbreak of cholera, so the adjective there, terrible, you could say that was emotive, but I think he's merely pointing out how widespread the cholera outbreak was, rather than actually showing any real emotion for the deaths of these people. So it is very much the tone of it is very much business-like. The other thing I've identified in the pink colour is references to statistics and figures. It's very precise in the way it presents evidence. So we've got phrases that make reference to numbers, so distances as well as time. So within 250 yards, a reference to distance, the numbers of fatal attacks, upwards of 500 fatal attacks, and then a reference to the time scale for the disease to spread. The greater number of cases terminated in a few hours, and then later on less than 6 days from commencement. So all those references to timescales give that business-like tone, because clearly this writer is presenting evidence why he thinks this epidemic has spread, because he wants to do something about it. Okay, so that's source A. The second source is much more modern. It's called COVID-19 Award Sisters Story. The blurb again gives a lot of clues about the perspectives and the viewpoints that you might expect, and I'm sure even before you read this you will already have some ideas of somebody who's working on a COVID ward, how they might feel about that illness. But we know it's from 2020 and it's a sister in charge of a ward. So exactly the same thing again. Please take the time to pause the video, get your sheet of paper, see what you can identify. If you were in the exam, what is the tone of it? Do you notice anything about the language, any language features that are similar to the source A use of language? Is there anything that's in this that isn't in source A, and why might that be? So if you think about it, for source A, we were talking about it being very formal, we're talking about use of statistics and very professional in tone. Does this have that? If it does, good, that we have a comparison there that shows similarities, but what does this have that the other one doesn't? So pause the video now, give yourself 5 minutes to see what you can identify. Okay, so hopefully you've paused the video and you've got your own list of language features. First thing you will notice here from the screen is we've got quite a few different techniques here. I think it does, as I've mentioned, share some of the ideas to do with professionalism. So in the green highlighting, there's a semantic field of very technical words, meta language, to do with hospitals. There's also a lot of use of the word team, so there's repetition in there. We've got teamwork, my team, hospital team, exec team, senior command teams, and that gives a sense of this being a very professional operation. And then we've got technical words like isolation cubicles, reference to oxygen, ventilated beds, ITU team, ventilator spaces. So you can talk about that formal tone, and that does link quite well with the first source, because this is clearly a professional woman who works in healthcare, and she uses the language that you would expect her to use. I think the key difference though is there is clearly much more use of language that's emotional. So I've identified in orange phrases that suggest things that are quite negative. So we've got horrendous ethical choices. So what she's saying is that their stories they've heard about COVID elsewhere suggest that people are having to make really difficult decisions about which basically are impossible to make, because you're choosing between one person and another. So horrendous ethical choices shows how they expect to be torn in some of the choices they're making. There is the metaphor there, our hell. So, you know, what she expects, or what her and her team expect COVID to be like in reality, is called our hell. Again, you can explore the language there and say what that suggests about how she feels about it, a point of view and a perspective. I've also highlighted the word stressful, which introduces the idea of emotive ideas. So it's emotive language because she's talking about the impact on people. In yellow, there are lots of really positive emotional words as well, because I think one of the key things about this that comes across in terms of its tone is how tight-knit the sister and her team are, because they're kind of in it together, and the language reflects that. So we've got a rule of 3 adjectives there: amazing, humbling, and incredible is how she describes her team. So you could explore that and talk about what that suggests about her point of view and perspective, and why she might feel like that about the people she's working with. There's also a reference to reassurance, which again is emotive and showing understanding. And then at the end there, a really powerful metaphor: a flood of lovely emotional responses. So the idea of a flood suggesting the intensity of how she feels about it. The final one there I mentioned about the flood, which is obviously a metaphor. There are, I think, the other key difference with this text and the other one is those little examples of language that might be called figurative. So we have a metaphor there, and the extract actually starts with a metaphor when it talks about COVID and then waiting for the COVID's arrival in the UK, a storm in a distant place, and it's extended into that second sentence there with the phrase unearth us. So the expectation of when COVID is going to arrive before they even set up the unit is something that adds tension, and you can sense how the sister and her team feel about what they're about to embark on, and it really creates a strong sense of being involved. So what you have to do though is make a comparison, and I think it's a really good idea before you write your response to actually think about what you're going to say, because sometimes it's better to write less that is more shaped and more considered than to just go straight into it and not really get your comparisons clear. So I've completed this plan just to show you the kind of points that you might come up with. So if you look on the table there, we've got source A key points, which summarise his viewpoint. So the viewpoint of the writer of source A is that he's very scientific, he's quite detached from the thing he's talking about. There's a sense in which, yes, he's obviously bothered about his work in the same way the sister is in source B, but equally he sees it as something separate from what's happening to the people who have died. There's a huge problem he wants to solve, but he doesn't have quite the emotional response that the writer of source B does. So the sister in source B, there's a very strong sense of teamwork. Writer of source A is on his own, whereas she's a member of a team, so that feeds into perspective as well, because she has to consider other people in what she's doing, whereas he's working alone. And she very much thinks of fighting COVID as like a military operation, and in fact some of the language that she uses suggests that as well. And I think that's really important because it shows her perspective is almost like a soldier on the front line, that this is something that she feels she needs to do. You also need to identify the similarities and differences, because this is a comparison question. So if you don't make comparisons, you won't get the marks. If you simply write about them in isolation and don't make those connections, it will lessen your mark. So these are the ideas that I came up with for my comparison. So what did you come up with? I think the key thing is that they both take a scientific, professional approach to the medical emergency. They are both medical professionals. One is a doctor, one is a nurse. So that is a similarity. The differences, I think, is the writer of source A is more detached, and he's examining cases and finding a scientific solution, whereas the writer of source B is more emotionally invested. That's not to say that she isn't professional, because she clearly is, but working on the front line in the way she and her team are obviously is going to impact on how they see it. Finally, if you look at the methods and devices used, talk about tone. I've already mentioned that an awful lot already, and why we have a difference in tone. And the difference in tone is entirely to do with their perspectives. One is somebody actually in the middle of a crisis, and one is somebody who's investigating its causes and is kind of coming in, he's not treating patients. So that will change tone. So it's an example of where perspective impacts on tone. The language in source B is former meta language of the medical profession in the same way as the writing in source A is, but there is a wider use of figurative language. So we've got the opening storm metaphor, and also the comparison with an army commander, and also much more emotive language. So that gives you the structure of how you might do your response. So look at the ideas that you have written and see if you can have a go at turning those ideas into a response that actually makes comparisons. To help you, you might want to freeze frame the current slide, or freeze frame the video so you can see these sentence starters on the current slide. Now, I'm not suggesting for a second that you have to use these starters, and in fact, sometimes it's better if you don't and you actually have a more fluid style in your writing. But if you are struggling to get your ideas on paper, this is a suggested writing frame. Some of you will be confident about writing your own ideas out in your own way and won't need sentence starters, and I would encourage you to do that. But what this does do is encourages those of you who are less confident to go down the line of making sure you are hitting all the assessment objectives. So the first bullet point is about writer's viewpoint, and then it encourages you to come up with an example, and then it encourages you to identify the subject terminology, and then it encourages you to analyze. And then the fifth bullet point encourages you to then make the comparison with source B and then repeat the process. So this is all this writing frame does. It's encouraging you to hit all the assessment objectives and to make those comparisons. This is a suggested approach. It works whatever the texts are. So one final thing I would encourage you to do is to re-watch this video with other examples in front of you of sources on a similar topic, perhaps some past paper questions that you've been given by your class teacher, and have a go at doing it yourself. By all means, submit them to your class teacher. The more practice you do and the more feedback you get, the better you will become at doing these kinds of questions.